I'm really happy to be moderating this panel today, tackling one of the big questions that I know is on many people's minds, which is, what is the value of credentials? Why and how do they have value? We know that things are changing a lot in the labor market, occupations, AI, so many things are happening, and we're really grappling with this question of what is the value of credential? I know that's something that we talked about this morning, that we've gone from the field of quantity now to trying to think about quality, right? How do we parse out what's good from what's not good? And there's been a lot of research that's come out recently, and taking different sort of frameworks to understanding the value of credential. And I think that's kind of an important question here, is how do we begin to make sense of it theoretically and also empirically and other perspectives. So I'm really excited to be joined by a really fantastic panel today. We've been sort of tracking all of the developments of recent research and writing and thinking that's been going on this topic. And we've sort of zoned in on 3 papers that we thought were really interesting and made some really good contributions to the field over the past year. And so we've invited our group of speakers here to talk about them. So we're really thrilled to have Jonathan Harris, Associate Professor of Law from Temple University, we're really delighted to have a legal scholar here to talk about a recent paper that he published in the Georgetown Law Journal on credentialism at work. So a very interesting perspective on the field and what's going on. We're also thrilled to have Debbie Wasden, Senior Vice President from the Burning Glass Institute, along with Mark Schneider, Nonresident Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, to talk about their work that came out just after our last NCRN meeting last June, but their work looking at the paper titled Holding New Credentials Accountable for Outcomes. So another really interesting look at outcomes. And then last but not least here is Ian Seyal from Brookings Institution, and his paper on the market value of non-degree credentials that recently came out in December. So really thrilled to have everybody here. I did want to, acknowledge, I think, before we get into the panel, we've been spending a lot of time reflecting on really important members of our community who've contributed quite a bit. And I also want to acknowledge, unfortunately, the passing of a colleague in our field who was really influential and a really important part of our community within the NCRN and also many other communities, and that's Stuart Anderson. I think many of you may have seen his untimely passing, and I think we all feel that very deeply, and so I think we just wanted to recognize what a great colleague he was for all of us and the great contributions he made, and just acknowledge that he is very much missed and very much honored. So we can just take a moment and reflect on Stu and all that he meant to us. And I know Debbie in particular worked very closely with him, so we all feel that loss. So I thought, for the panel, we would begin. We don't have slides, so we're going to, not go through formal presentations of the research. But we thought each panelist here would take a few minutes, just 3 or 4 minutes, to briefly kind of tell us about the work that they've done on this topic, some of the motivations for what interested them, and what are some of the key findings and takeaways. So if you want, maybe Jonathan, you can start us off, and we'll go down the panel.
Can you hear me? Yeah, okay, great. Thank you.
The mics take a second.
No, I can hear it now. Thank you. Well, thank you very much for inviting me and Kyle too. It's really neat to be here. I appreciate you all welcoming a legal academic into this space. It's a new territory for me. So, I teach and research labor and employment law primarily, specifically looking at restrictions on worker mobility, things like non-compete agreements and other things like that keep workers from going from job to job. Also, the legal implications of workforce development and kind of intersections between employment law, contract law, and consumer law. And so you mentioned credentialism at work. I also wrote another article with my esteemed co-author, Olivia Lamb, who's here from the 1199 SEIU Training and Employment Funds, called Is There a Right to Job Quality? And I got really interested in this because I was realizing in higher education, we were talking a lot about elite credentials, right? Like what it takes to get into the top universities. And I was thinking, well, okay, that's great, but the vast majority of young people are not going to those elite universities. As a matter of fact, they're not going to any four-year university. So who are we talking about, and what about everyone else? And so I kind of started looking at this issue from a real outsider's perspective, and came across this idea of credentialism, which, at least in the paper, I define as two things. The combination of, one, the stacking of additional credentials, not for the skills they convey, but instead the signaling effect that they have. And then two, the kind of additional accumulation of more and more credentials with diminishing returns from each additional credential. And I learned a lot and wrote a lot about this in the paper, including the kind of the longer term trajectory of what we're looking at. So, even as recently as like the 70s and 80s, a lot of job training, workforce development policy was around creation of jobs, right? And that shifted around that time more towards individual credential attainment, kind of this blossoming of the private credential market. And in turn, what I saw was kind of an offloading of costs and risks of training onto workers. And another thing I noticed was that credentials seem to fluctuate a lot based on the relative slackness of the labor market, rather than the skills necessarily needed for that job. So when labor markets are tighter, credential requirements lower. When labor markets are looser, then credential requirements go up by employers. I was looking into burdens on workers of color and immigrant workers, in particular of credentials, as well as what I call bogus credentials. Some of them are called, for example, TRAPs, Training Repayment Agreement Provisions, which you may or may not have heard of. I didn't come up with the acronym, but I have written about those in another article called Unconscionability in Contracting for Worker Training that came out in 2021. That basically was like astonished by this trend of employers offloading training costs onto workers after they start the job by saying, if you leave within the first 2 years, let's say, you owe us $20,000, which we estimate to be the amount we spent training you, right? Which I would have normally called onboarding, right? Like just regular, this is what you do when you start a new job. But now it's like offloading those costs onto workers and also keeping them bound to that employer for those workers that can't afford to leave. And so, one other thing I found was that it seemed to me that for workers that are trying to increase, their economic well-being, improve their economic lot, there had been sort of a shift away from collective organizing and unionization, which we saw much more of mid-century, and towards a kind of an individualist credential stacking as a way to do that, which in turn kind of de-emphasized collectivization. For workers to come together to improve their economic conditions, and instead kind of almost get into this credentialed arms race potentially with each other around who can kind of accumulate the most credentials. And so these are a lot of the different things that I was really interested in exploring in this paper, and so it's what brought me here.
Great, thanks. All right. Yeah, just go down.
So I'm not going to talk about specific research, but I'm going to start with a particular story, okay? So, and this has to do with the cultural gap that exists between probably every single person in this room and the people that we talk about, workers, people who are looking to launch jobs. I always like Jeff when he starts talking about for 10 years he worked in construction, right? It's just a totally different world that most of us have no exposure to. There are probably more PhDs in this room than people who went to a community college. And that's the reality of this. So here's my personal story and my introduction to the cultural divide that we have to face. So my daughter, I check all the time with her, like, I'm going to talk about you again. I'm going to talk about your kids. Is this okay? And she says, yeah, because whatever you're saying is true. You're not making stuff up. Okay, so I have, Jeff, you're retiring way too young, right? I mean, so I have two grown daughters. My oldest daughter is in her mid-50s. She's an incredibly successful attorney. And she has two teenage boys, okay? And some of you probably all of you were teenagers at one time. Some of you may even have teenagers or kids that are getting into that. A teenage boy is like the worst animal in the entire world. I mean, there's nothing else that you could say. What did he want to do? He wanted to play video games, he wanted to eat, and he wanted to sleep, right? And that was his entire life. And my daughter, you know, all the right credentials. She said, what are we going to do with this kid, right? Is he actually going to go to a four-year school? I said, he doesn't have to go to a four-year school, right? It's not necessary. I said, like, take a look at all the work that I've done, right? Identifying degrees of value, associate degrees, technical degrees. Then I start sending her articles from the Wall Street Journal about the value of apprenticeships. And the one I sent her, the last one, and I'll tell you why it was the last one, it was about some 21-year-old kid who finished an apprenticeship program in pipe fitting. He was making $110,000 a year, no college degree, 21 years old. So I said, that's pretty good. And she said, read the rest of the article. At 6 a.m. in the morning, this guy is crawling around in rusted pipes. Do you think Leo is ever going to do that, right? And okay, but we need to think of something else, because at the time when he was like sleeping, eating, and playing video games literally 24 hours a day, I said, we need to figure out something else. And she said, Mark, if you ever tell him about credentials and non-degree programs and apprenticeships, I'm going to disown you. He has to go to a four-year college. He needs that degree. It turned out, it turned out that he actually is going to four-year university. My daughter says, I'm budgeting not 4 years at $90,000 a year, but 6 years, because I have to assume that the first year he's there, he's just going to blow this, right? So there's a big cultural divide, right? And I think we have to understand that. And that's really, really fundamentally important. The second part is part of an earlier part of my life when I worked trying to get information about ROI of different programs into the hands of high school students. This was the hardest thing I ever did in my entire life. Went from one state to the other, had endorsements of governors and chambers of commerce, some of the work Holly supported. It was trying to get important information into the hands of people, kids, and their parents, which turned out to be the key to a lot of this, about, like, this is what happens if you choose to go to this university and major in sociology. This is what happens if you go to this other university and major in business. These are what your life chances look like. This is the kind of earnings that you're going to make. The most critical part was turning this information into usable, understandable information. I ran a company called College Measures when I was working at AIR. We started up this startup, went bankrupt, so I'm not a successful entrepreneur. But the motto was we want information that's usable, useful, and used. And that, to me, is like what should be motivating our work. And this requires an incredible amount of translation, right? And that's not a skill that all of us have, but it's a skill that we need. We have to talk about things in plain English. When I was the director of IES, my entire style guide was short sentences, strong verbs, right? And I mean, Jeff and I we've been around this thing for a long time, but that's what we need. Short sentences, strong verbs. And I said, we're never going to publish anything that's more than 15 pages, and it has to be accompanied with a 4-pager and a 1-pager, right? That's it. Well, the part of the problem was that we were contracting with companies like AIR and RTI and SRI, all frustrated academics, and they wanted to write 40, 50, 60, 80 pages, dense with footnotes, and like, throw this away. Right? Someone mentioned this, I think it was Jeff again. He said, like, oh, you're going to show a 10 by 10 table with 8 decimal points. I mean, this is insane. This is totally insane. So, I mean, we live in a world, if we even do 1 decimal point, this is probably overkill, right? We live in a world to the left of the decimal point. So when we have academics doing, like, incredibly complicated, I used to do this too, right? Incredibly complicated models. and like a fifth and sixth decimal point. Nobody cares. Absolutely nobody cares. So we need to think about translation. We need to think about plain English. We need to think about good writing. Most of the stuff doesn't come naturally to anybody, and it requires work. And my joke is, it's not a joke actually, if you want to teach someone how not to write, get them a PhD in economics. Okay, the final point, which to me is a real puzzlement. And so I do a lot of work on ROI. I work with Burning Glass. Too many programs have no ROI, right? Something like, so the bachelor's degree actually of all the levels is the most successful. But 25% of programs, bachelor programs in the United States have low or negative ROI.
How about enrollment?
How about enrollment?
Versus enrollment in programs. It's lots of very tiny programs.
No, that is true, but we know that there are lots of programs in big universities with lots of students in them that have low ROI. So 25% of those bachelor degrees have low ROI. About 40% of master's degrees programs have no ROI. So the master's program is actually a great deal for universities. They're cash cows. They're not good for too many of these programs are not good for universities. For students. Associate degrees, 40% have no ROI, right? And when we start counting in the failure to graduate, the percentage is even higher. So the work that we do with Burning Glass and I did this work, and the credentials of value, 15%. So what does that tell us about the higher education and the training enterprise in this country? I mean, I don't know, right? But all I know is that we look at the whole panoply of programs that we deliver, and many of them are not producing degrees or credentials of value. And this is I believe it's going to get worse when AI starts disrupting everything. It's already disrupting many things. So optimists, I'm not sure if this is the optimistic view or truly pessimistic view. So one of my good friends works at OECD, and he's mapped the growth of AI, how AI is consuming more and more cognitive skills. And how many people, and we see this all the time, how many people are going to be displaced in which professions? So many economists think, oh, this is a temporary disruption. We've been through this many times before, and we always create more jobs and become more prosperous. I think part of the difference is that AI is affecting people that other revolutions haven't affected before. And the speed at which this is happening is like nothing we've ever seen before. So my friend Stuart Elliott at OECD, he's done some very interesting work about AI and cognitive demand. So he says, like, I don't know, maybe 30 years, and that's when he talks to me, because he thinks I'm a work chauvinist, by the way, right? Because I still believe that work matters. He says, no, in 30 years, all four-year colleges, four-year degree programs are just like, like, what are we going to do? What are we going to train people? Because most of it's, and we've talked about this before, that this mixture of job training and education is unique in American education, in world education. It's different than what most people do. But like he says, like, we better start figuring out how to change programs of study, because most people are not going to be needed, because the cognitive skills that they're learning are just like AI is going to do better, right? He thinks 10 years after that, given the advances and the combination of AI and robotics, the kinds of skills that we talk about as like good skills, plumbing, electricians, that's all, he thinks it's all going to, and he's been right about a lot of stuff, by the way. He thinks that those are going to be gone by the combination of robotics and AI. So I said to him, like, what should we be thinking about? What do we need to be planning? So this is like a really high level issue, right? And I'm worried about getting my kid into, my grandson into a school. But he's saying, like, well, the model of what we're trying to teach kids is wrong, right? What we should be teaching them, and this is where he's beyond me. He says, like, we need to do two things. The first thing we need to do is we need to start teaching people how to enjoy leisure. right? Right, because everybody's going to have more leisure. I mean, again, this is in his worldview, and when I say, what about the dignity of work and the importance of work and the structure that work gives, and this is when he starts saying, you're a work chauvinist, right? So I mean, that's fundamentally important. And the other thing, which, again, I mean, there's so many debates about this, is like, if we are not producing people that can find jobs, or the job market is radically changing, and maybe they're, so what about, how do we support people? How do we get people money? So his solution, of course, is a universal basic income, and that leads to all kinds of other discussions. Thank you.
Hard to follow. Okay. Yeah, right. First, before I jump in, thank you for that lovely recognition of my friend and great colleague, Stu Andresen. For many of you who have worked, this is a room that really knew him. He has a wife and 4 children, the oldest of which is the same age as of my daughter, who's both in 6th grade. So as you're continuing to think about Stu and his legacy, we've put on LinkedIn ways to support, but we're also thinking about how to keep his legacy of work alive. So hopefully this is the beginning point of thinking about the foundation that Stu dedicated his life and his career towards in helping more people get access to economic opportunity and mobility. So with that, thank you for that, and we're all still grieving and thinking about him. The panel name, as I'm staring at it, sort of helps me think about some of my opening remarks. First and foremost, the value of credentials. It sounds like a binary. Is it valuable or is it not? And I think it's time for us to stop thinking about data as adversarial and binary. It is about understanding how data can be used, deployed, and structured in a way that's complementary, helpful, accelerating, making your programs better. Nobody wants to build a program that has 0 ROI. Folks want to have students get access to better jobs, build stackable credentials. People want access to information so that they can make a more informed decision. And the value of credentials is not monolithic and it's not singular, but it gets boiled down into that because we've tended to be very adversarial to data in this way. And then the second piece of the panel is why and how, but we haven't asked for whom. And so when we at Burning Glass Institute embarked on a journey that got rolled out as the Credential Value Index, we embarked on a journey to see, could we create a data set that hasn't existed, that provides outcome measures for the universe of non-degree credentials, given the barrier that existed of a lack of information. So if you couldn't get access to provider information at scale, which has been very difficult, instead of just saying, nope, we can't evaluate them, we have no idea, and we can't give information to anybody, we decided to deploy our data sets in service of seeing what we could see and what we could understand. We have a view into the career histories of over 65 million workers in America over time, and that had never been cleaned, harmonized, deduplicated, or evaluated for the non-degree credential side of what somebody had participated in, and we had never taken that, compared it to what we know from the public data sets like iPads or others. We had not looked at demand data, wage data, and we did that in CVI to be able to look and see what can you know and what can you measure about the outcomes of non-degree credentials. First and foremost, we found that the majority of them, as Mark mentioned, and we published, which is headline worthy but doesn't tell the whole story, is that if you look at only wages, the majority, vast majority of non-degree credentials are failing. That should scare everybody in this room, because if a policymaker sees that stat, which they do, what do you think they're going to say? If an employer sees that stat, which they already think this whole landscape is entirely too chaotic, thus they don't care, nor do they recognize these non-degree credentials. They think, they don't work, I don't care, right? So we need to lean into the ones that do have an ROI and start asking ourselves, why? Is it just because of the occupation and the sector? No. Some of these programs are delivering something different. We also looked at the broader landscape of measures and metrics to look at the fact that wages is not an acceptable proxy for ROI and value on its own. Does this credential help somebody get a new job in a new field? Where is this person in their promotions 1 year, 3 year, 5 years out? How does this person fare in terms of the life of their career based on when they took this? So there are a lot of different motivations that somebody could be, and there's a lot of different outcome measures that you can see that actually broaden the value of credentials by traditional metrics. If you look at wages, job access, promotion, job switching, it actually goes to about 1 in 3. Now that's still actually quite abysmal, saying that we've gone to 30% or 33% of measurable outcomes by traditional metrics. But at least you have a bigger pool to dive into on what is actually working and why. And then we need to start thinking about that other large percentage to see why are they not giving us, and should they go away? Or should they be changed? Or are we looking and missing value propositions that are causing enrollments and then not necessarily delivering? Or maybe they are delivering. Maybe somebody's taking it based on wanting to learn something and not necessarily wanting to gain a new job. But those hidden measures are very easily usurped by the fact that you can't see a measurable gain unless we're able to define them. So we're in a moment now where, and I think about one of the major partners that we had in this work who said, I get, like, everybody in this room just says more data. If only I had more data. Data, data, data. We don't have data. So we embarked on this journey to build an actionable data set that you can see the outcomes of 26,000 non-degree credentials. And the question was, why is that not now being used? And I think that that's where I want us to start to think about as a community. What data sets have now been built? What data do we have access to? And how is that getting linked so that we have the ultimate goal, which is less, in my opinion, about from the higher ed perspective. That's a very important perspective. But I am very much in the Mark camp, which is how is somebody able to consume this information and make a more informed decision that is right for them? If we anchor on that, we can then start to layer into employer recognition. It's a natural bridge. We layer into what is the market bearing, who's offering it, and where. But we have to start from a place of what is an informed consumer able to consume, what information do they have access to, and what will that help them drive a decision towards. And we currently now have data access. Not entirely coordinated or harmonized or all the things, but states have data, they're building more data. We have outcomes data as like a leg of a stool. There are other data sets out there, and I think we should start moving towards a question of use and for whom as we continue on in these conversations.
Thank you. I think we're on the same page. Our research is quite aligned in trying to look at what drives value for whom, what are the conditions that create value for non-degree credentials. I've been working at Brookings for the last few years, and we've touched on a lot of different topics. The through line has been trying to make things actionable for policy and for people, and that's the lens we took to this work also. And we wanted to move from not just are credentials valuable, not just which credentials are valuable, but under what circumstances are they valuable, for whom are they valuable, are there differences in the types of credentials? And so we did that in three ways. We looked at the value, how the value changes for someone's first credential versus the accumulation of credentials. I think similar to what Jonathan was talking about. And we built this measure of job relevance for a credential. We find that it's crucial. The value of a credential is not the same for everybody. It depends on where you're working. It sounds obvious, but it's important to know where people want to go before you think about which credentials are valuable to them. And then the third thing we did with this research is look at the value of credentials based on different worker profiles. We find that non-degree credentials are significantly more valuable for people earlier in their career and for people without bachelor's degrees. So I'll leave it there, and we'll come back to this. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for that. I actually want to ask Ian and Debbie both to go into a little bit more detail on the kind of data that you use, because you both use novel data sets that haven't been used before. So I was hoping you could tell us a little bit more about those sources of data and how you validated them, and also in what ways they allowed you to operationalize these measures of value that we've been talking about.
You want to start?
Sure, yeah. So we use resume data also, which gives us a sense of workers' history. Because we didn't get it from Burning Glass or Lightcast, we had to do our own work, deduplicating. People write all kinds of stuff on their resumes and call them credentials. Many of them are not credentials. So we did a lot of work matching them to credential engines, repository of credentials. We use their categorization of the different types of credentials, and then we assess value based on those types and on these other dimensions that I mentioned. When we tell people that we use resume data to talk about credentials, they usually bring up two concerns. One is that the people who make resumes and post them online are quite different from people who don't. That's 100% true. It's not a huge problem, we don't think, for us. I mean, we're looking within the universe of people who have resumes and put them online, and then we're asking, do those add value, which is a limitation. But I think our result about people being earlier in their career and without college degrees implies that any value we find in credentials, given these other constraints, will also confer value to people who are not posting their resumes online. The other thing that comes up sometimes is that the data is self-reported because it's resumes, and people could lie on their resumes. I couldn't believe it. I didn't actually think this was a problem. I looked into it. Apparently, it's very common. People lie on their resumes all the time, which is a bit surprising. But it's also kind of interesting. I mean, if people are lying, and they're also choosing which credentials to report on their resumes, but they're making a choice about that, it's signaling some value. I mean, people understand which credentials are valuable, and if you see that reflected in the labor market and the jobs that they hold, it tells you something about the value of credentials.
So we have created sort of a data engine, but in this case, which is what powers BGI from both harmonizing many different data sets, as well as bringing in all kinds of models and applications. But to go into this one in particular, we took both our social profiles data set, which is the career histories of 65 million Americans, and we extracted the information around their career histories, education, employment histories, job titles, wages, demographic information, and then we cleansed it, we organized it, we deduplicated it, we aligned it to the different SIP4, SIP5, SIP6, all the different ways that you can do that. And in fact, it's an incredibly messy data set. Just this was we had 25 economists, senior economists and interns work on this project for close to 9 months, which is why I say it's sort of it's a novel data set. We did not just have like a taxonomy that you just, because if you think about it, if you're getting a certificate, you could name the provider the issuer that you got it from. You could use that, you could misspell it. You could use an acronym. I went to UMD. I went to University of Maryland. I went to UMUC. I went to University of Maryland College Park, or University of Maryland University College, and then you continue on with whatever you think the credential was actually called. So it's actually very complex to both be able to get the naming convention and the acronyms, which was even more complex, to be honest, to be deduplicated, as well as who are the issuers of those. And then when we evaluated the outcomes, which to your point, Ian, about some of the concerns, we built out a counterfactual set for each and every pool that we evaluated against. So we took similar age, career history, location, demographics of the basket of folks in the graduating pool, and then against a similar basket of folks who did not report having that credential. And for every reported metric in the credential value index, we had that against a fairly robust N of 50. So we wanted to make sure that we had what we could call measures that we could stand behind, knowing that it wasn't just a one-off, and we actually saw these measurable gains or not in this pool. It is why we have only published at that level of rigor 26,000 credentials. We have since then built out a repository and of over 1 million defined credentials that we are working to create definition and deduplicate and assign more probabilistic measures and methods, but that is not what folks have seen today. The only other thing I'd say is that we also apply it to demand, because if you look at job postings, they tell you a lot, which is they give names and they give commonly asked for, and so you can actually triangulate what is being asked for in the market, not just on the value, but on the nomenclature against what folks are reporting and those kind of things. So those are all different ways. And then we also have state partnerships where sometimes we have access to large amounts of state data, which has names, which then we can match, but you can't actually make that public. So we use a lot of those as verification and validation efforts to make sure that what we're seeing from the outside in actually matches to what is being measured at the state where there is measurement taking place.
All right, so I have one question for Jonathan, just to kind of circle back here to where we started. So I wanted to get you to talk a little bit more about the concept of credentialism, and how does that help us make sense of this whole conversation around the value of credentials, and particularly also thinking about how do we put that in perspective based on your studies as a legal scholar about other kinds of markets, and how does this particular market of non-degree credentials function in comparison to what you've seen in other arenas?
Yeah, so it's also interesting to me because as I was studying this, I was learning that there's this kind of world of legal protections for workers on one side, and then this world of workforce development on the other. And I kind of come from the former group, the group of legal protections, and realized like there's not a lot of conversation between the two. And I was like, well, this is really fascinating because this, we're talking about the same groups of people here. And, whether it's pre-employment or post-employment, that shouldn't make a difference. And so I did do some kind of research into kind of histories and theories behind this. I mean, Gary Becker's human capital theory, the idea that education pays because it imparts skills. skills bias, technological change theory. That's technology requires more education. And then I came across Randall Collins's credentialist theory. Anybody read Randall Collins' book, Credential Society from 1979? You familiar? Right? Okay, one. Wow. Okay. Two. Okay. All right. Kyle, right. Three. Thank you. Yes. Okay. Right. So so I read that and I was like, okay, he was talking about this, almost 50 years ago. The idea of credentialism, the idea of this, stacking of credentials, not for skills, but instead for the paper itself, right? It's really about the paper that matters, right? And I think we've been kind of recognizing this. And that's not to say that's not valuable to the worker. It clearly is valuable to the worker, the job applicant, because it's getting them the job. The question, though, for me, was like, well, what about like the purpose of the credential is really about, the skills, the training that it gives, or workers just getting that on the job anyway, because employers have to give their firm-specific training in order to really allow workers to be productive at their particular workplace. So kind of looking back at this longer history and then tying it to some of the more recent research that I was coming across, like this fluctuation of credential requirements based on the relative slackness of the job market. It's this idea of cyclical credential change rather than structural. It's not the fact that the jobs themselves are necessarily requiring different levels of credentials. It's this cycle of just the strength of the job market at any given time seems to dictate in many ways the amount of credentials and the types of credentials that are needed for that job. I read this 2014 Burning Glass study on, the fact that during and after the Great Recession, it was looking at different job titles and credential requirements for them. Before the Great Recession, for example, only 26% of credit authorizers, that particular title, had a bachelor's degree. But during the Great Recession, when they were hiring for new positions for that same title, 66% of the postings required a bachelor's, even though it was the same job. The job itself hadn't changed. And then post-COVID, how credential requirements dropped because there was this huge demand for labor all of a sudden when the economy quickly recovered after the pandemic, dropping requirements for credentials for nurses, for teachers, right? These demands, high demand jobs. And so, looking at this from a legal scholar lens, from a legal rights lens, I was thinking, wow, the non-degree credential market in many ways to me looks more like a consumer products market than kind of traditional education. We heard yesterday, a lot about the Wild West of credentials, and I was thinking the same thing when I was looking at this landscape and how much they've proliferated over time, and how, like I mentioned before, a lot of the guidance that I think used to be there is lacking now. One thing that I learned was like this idea of unions having in the past been kind of the purveyors of skills and then helping workers match those skills with jobs and getting them into those jobs. Dorothy Sue Collins wrote this idea of occupational unionism that was basically this idea of, the union will basically train workers. They, for example, in the restaurant industry, this was common, where there was it was the waitresses union, really powerful in the 50s and 60s. It was waitresses because it was all women, but the union was basically training the waitresses, and then the restaurant would call the union and say, so we need, three-level waitresses and 2 4-level waitresses. And then, the union would say, okay, great. And they would send them, wages were set according to the union contract. That was the way it happened in cities with high union density, like where I live in Philadelphia and Chicago and others. With the rapid decline of union density in the 70s and beyond, that all went out the window, and we're kind of left at the landscape we are now. And the last thing I was thinking of was just kind of the legal standards, right, around the policies that we've all been talking about at this conference. For example, WIOA. And I was thinking, well, in the consumer landscape, for example, workers have a private right of action, for unfair, deceptive acts or practices, or in the employment context, they have a private right of action for employers that violate their legal rights. And I was looking at WEO and I was like, wow, there's no private right of action for workers, the trainees themselves, to complain, I guess, about, the kinds of training they're receiving through WEO programs and what they're getting out of it. And then, at the same time, if you look at parallels, like the Federal Trade Commission, for example, has this 100-year-long history of reining in unscrupulous correspondence schools, for example, that I was looking into and was fascinating. I saw it yesterday. Correspondence schools are not part of the workforce Pell. I think a good thing. But since 1935, the Federal Trade Commission has been looking at the providers of these credentials through a consumer protection lens, and shutting down or otherwise reining in some of these most unscrupulous credential providers. And so part of what I've been doing is thinking about this landscape from different legal contexts as well, including the application of consumer protection laws. And last thing I'll say was just, I mentioned my co-author, Livia Lamb. We're now working on a project looking into the codification of labor management training partnerships, and kind of taking that model and applying it outside of the union context. Now that union density is around 6% at this point in the private sector, that's not something that is going to be there for the vast majority of workers. But how can we take very successful LMTP models and apply those for everyone else that doesn't have a union? And so those are some of the things I've been thinking about most recently.
Thank you. Well, I have many more questions, but I'm going to hold them because I imagine you all probably have many questions. So I see Jeff in the front here.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to start off with a little thing on Ian's thing about lying on resumes. I have to confess that the PhD on my resume is plumbing, heating, and drains. But anyways, I've got two questions. One, Mark, you've always been one of my favorite disruptors along with Tom Wico in the field here. And I wonder about disrupting your own thinking. You're somewhat responsible for the use of wages in some of this measurement through college measures and work on the scorecard. And we've landed on the mean, or the median, whichever. And your work on dropouts and diplomas, you look a lot at variation. So what might you consider that we do with variance to understand earnings? There are people with the low ROI who actually have really good ROI on particular majors. Secondly, with the scorecard, it sucks when we come down to certificates. 20% of certificates, many schools don't have good coverage, so how do we make it better? How do we stop pretending it's precise? And then Jonathan, very quickly, with what you're talking about in credentialism, how does this equate with adequacy? My understanding is there is no guaranteed right to education, therefore no guaranteed right to value of education, but at the state level, there's the movement towards state constitutions forcing governors to be responsible. So how does your work on credentialism feed into that? Thank you.
So the Mutual Admiration Society, right? So, and we've been bumping up against the same kinds of issues for a very long time. This is why you're too young to retire. We have the whole world in front of us. Okay, so the issue of variance is incredibly important, right? And I think we ignored it, right, for at our own peril, right? So the easiest way to think about variance is by across programs, right? But I think the issue that you're talking about is within programs, what percentage are successful and what percentage are not successful. I think that, so where I've shifted a lot of attention of my work away from the federal government, and I'll come back to that in a second, to working with states. And as the current administration pushes to return education to the states and return more responsibility to the states, I am actually working with a bunch of states, and their interest in these kinds of issues surpasses anything that I was able to do when I was running IAS. I mean, so the future for me is really how are we going to do the work with states? They have better data. They have and they care. They really and truly care. And many states, as you know, I mean, we've been working for a long time to break down the barriers between higher ed and K-12, right? Despite the first panel yesterday, where K-12 was not represented, which was like, okay, that's a different story. But what else is happening right now is, of course, the breakdown between the labor departments and the education departments. So many states have either started merging them or been working towards merging them. And state by state, this is, I think, a movement that we need to track, we need to monitor, and ultimately we need to work with states to get their data and to help them. And the business of like useful, used, and usable is something that resonates really, really, really within the states. So I'm very optimistic that we'll be able to push forward with states. I mean, Texas, I've been working with Texas on and off for 15, 20 years. I mean, they have incredible data, and they're very generous with it, right? And I love Texas because they're willing to experiment. They're willing to try all kinds of things. But there are other states that are coming up, that Indiana, Katie Jennings, I mean, incredible. So I think we should look to states. We should partner with states. We need to do that. In contrast, I'll tell you a story about my dealings with OMB about non-credit activity, non-credit. So I was looking around, right, and more stuff is non-credit in community colleges. I mean, the estimates are, all over the place, but they're high, right? So I proposed that iPads collect non-credit activity. And of course, everything, I mean, this is via NCS and iPads, and it had to go to OMB, and they said no. So why did they say no? Because iPads is rooted in Title IV, right? And we cannot, I'm sorry, they would not, they could, but they would not approve a non-credit data collection via iPads. So, like, I mean, all I had to do was show them all the data. Like, what are you, crazy? Like, look at what's going on. And how could we not track this? And like, sorry, Title IV. So what I was able to get out of it was a voluntary, they were going to agree to a voluntary collection. So the first question was, would you like to give us the data? And if they said yes, then there was a whole bunch of questions that could happen. But I mean, so this is, so the short-sightedness of the federal government in terms of catching all this stuff is, I think, critically important. But I'm betting on states.
Yeah. So speaking of states, I mean, I think that one example that I've been encouraged by are the idea of creating some kind of tripartite boards that, for example, look something like the California High Road Training Partnership that has been, state implemented, state funded, and seems to be a good model for bringing in different players, including, like, again, I was looking at this from the outside, and I was like, how is it that workforce development boards are statutorily required to be 51% employer represented, right? That's like really interesting to me, but having more of a wider set of stakeholders that are part of it, and really listening to the workers, right? Listening to the workers in terms of what it is they need, what they're looking for, and also what they know about the jobs that they do, and how to make those jobs better, and also the kind of training that would be most useful for those for quality. And then in terms of looking at things from a legal lens, I've looked at the idea of, for example, using disparate impact theory under the Greggs versus Duke Power case against employers that possibly might not intentionally be doing this, but are requiring certain levels of credentials of job applicants that have a disproportionate impact on applicants of color, for example, or immigrant job applicants, to really, more than anything, take a step back and say, why are we demanding all of these credentials? Like, what's the reason for it? Is it really going to help them do better? Is it a good indicator of productivity at the job? Is it something that can replace, any kind of additional onboarding training we'd have to do anyway? And say, wow, okay, well, if this really is having a disproportionate impact, if those things were kind of contemplated in that lens, then maybe there would be a second, people take a breath and say, okay, do we really need to demand these kinds of credentials. And Peter Blair, who's at Harvard, has a new paper that's kind of looking at Grigg's disparate impact theory along those lines as well.
Is there one last question, or? Okay. Well, I think we're just about out of time anyway, so I want to thank our panelists and allow